There are plenty of videos out there about periods and the menstrual cycle, but when I tell you, this is the only video that you need to watch, okay? So send it to your girlfriends, any coach who trains women, y'all need to watch this, and any student not really getting much out of their education, okay? Now, I'm not even trying to gas myself up here. This video is like an entire degree. We're going to split it into two parts because we do have a lot of ground to cover, but this is an all-inclusive, comprehensive guide for how to be a woman and how to train, how to eat, how to work around your menstrual cycle so it doesn't always feel like an uphill battle. So let's get into it. In today's video, we are covering off the basics, how the menstrual cycle works. And if you already know this, we can put your knowledge to the test. Now, we would consider a 28 to 42 day cycle to be considered within normal or healthy range for a female. And hormones, that big fancy word, are what takes care of the entire cycle. Okay, they tell the female body when to grow the egg, when to release an egg, when to prepare the uterus or the womb for a potential baby, and it also calls out when it's time to take the L and accept ain't no baby making happening this month, so let's pack up and try again next month. So there's a few different hormones and systems and organs at play here, and as we all know, the fluctuations throughout the month can really affect a woman as she tries to live her damn life. I mean, one week she may be feeling like Thor up in the gym. She is hitting PBs, she's not even that hungry, she's thriving, she is glowing, her skin is looking brand new, she's snapping necks while she walks down the street, she's feeling lean, sassy, sexy, she's getting compliments from her boss at work, things are going great until certain hormones arrive on schedule and it all goes downhill from there. So let's break down what exactly is going on in each week of the cycle. Okay, so let's start off with phase one. We have just come off of our period. We are in the follicular phase. Now, what is happening? We actually start in the brain. And what happens in the brain is a particular structure called the hypothalamus is releasing a hormone called GnRH in pulses. And GnRH communicates with a neighboring structure in the brain called the pituitary gland. And don't worry, I'm not gonna get any more technical than that. So the pituitary gland picks up on these signals and says, okay, cool, let's start to release FSH. Now, FSH is an important hormone that you should probably remember. It's called follicle stimulating hormone. Now, as the name suggests, FSH drops down to the ovaries and it communicates with follicles in the ovaries. Now, these follicles contain underdeveloped eggs, okay? So this is kind of the precursor to everything that happens as the cycle continues. Now, FSH tells the follicle to do two things. Number one, it tells the follicle to begin maturing and growing the egg, okay, to prepare for later on. And secondly, it tells the follicle to start to release estradiol, or as we most commonly refer to it, estrogen, okay? Now, this is a very well-known female hormone and it does a bunch of great things for women, which we'll talk about later on, okay? But the main function in reproductivity is that estrogen begins to thicken the endometrium lining, okay? And that is basically the lining that coats the uterus or the womb to prepare for a baby. Now, estrogen makes us feel good. Okay, obviously it has its primary functions, but it just gives a woman her essence. And so naturally, it's a really good time to be a woman. And I'm gonna use an analogy here throughout the 4 phases of the month to really help these concepts stick. I want you to think of the follicular phase as the season of spring. Season is a time for growth and flourishing. You know, things are growing in your body. The egg is growing, the endometrium lining is growing, but it's also a good time for you to grow and build, okay? So a really good time for you to push your training hard, work hard in your job, and really focus on building everything, okay? We'll talk in more detail in the next video about the applications and exactly how you can take advantage of the follicular phase. But for now, that is phase one. Phase two, ovulation. I'm sure y'all heard the term ovulation glow. It's a real thing. Let's talk about the science behind it. Okay, now remember that hormone in the brain, GnRH, the one that tells the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone? Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, okay? So GnRH also releases another hormone called LH, or luteinizing hormone, okay? Constantly altering the ratios of FSH and LH, okay? And the brain knows when to switch gears and produce more of one than the other. And the way this works is we know that estrogen has been dominating so far through the follicular phase, and it basically tells the brain, yo, I've been around for a while. So it's time to switch gears and start cranking up the LH and get this menstrual cycle flowing. So what happens is LH gets released from the brain, travels down to the ovaries, and basically tells the egg, yo, it's time to leave. So because of the presence of LH, the follicle that contains the now fully mature egg swells and bursts, and the egg basically pops out, travels down to the fallopian tubes, and sits around waiting for our special swimmer sperm friends to get the job done and make the potential baby. Okay, if that doesn't happen within about 24 hours or so, then the egg basically just gets reabsorbed or recycled by the body, okay? Back to the follicle, the one that swelled and bursted a while ago. So it actually does this really cool magic trick. It transforms into a structure called the corpus luteum. And this literally happens within minutes after ovulation, okay? And basically what the corpus luteum does is it switches up the hormones. Specifically, it triggers a surge in testosterone and progesterone. Now, it's not just the corpus luteum that produces the testosterone and progesterone. It's also the adrenal glands. Now, if you don't mind, I am gonna tangent for a moment because fun fact, this is the very reason why women need more sleep than men. Because our adrenals work so much harder. If you think about it, right? Testosterone is produced by the testes in men, aka the ball sack, okay? Whereas in women, it's produced in the adrenal glands. But the adrenals are also responsible for producing some of our estrogen, a lot of our progesterone, as well as our cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline. So it is doing overtime. It is working a lot harder throughout the day compared to men's adrenals. And that's why women need between like 9 to 10 hours of sleep compared to the say 7 to 8 hours that men really need. But yeah, the more you know. Anyways, back to ovulation. Because this is a time where our 3 major sex hormones are peaking, it is a great time to be a woman. Like, you thought the follicular phase was good? Come on, bro. You've got your testosterone peaking, so not only is your cognitive function improving and you're incredibly sexually aroused, and you feel a little bit more competitive to chase those PBs and outperform your male coworkers, but we're also experiencing that beautiful surge in estrogen to complement it as well. Alongside feeling more aroused, we also tend to increase our pheromones, and our pheromones actually change, our scent changes. It's a really good time to essentially attract a mate. And there's an evolutionary reason behind that. It's because it's the only time in the month that you can actually conceive. A lot of people don't know this, but your fertile window is only about a week long at most, and this is the time. And so women tend to feel more beautiful. Faces become more symmetrical, our skin begins to glow. We see that water retention starts to drop because of progesterone. This is all to support a time of high fertility. All right, we're more likely to attract men for procreation. So back to my analogy of the 4 seasons. Think of ovulation as your hot girl summer. Okay, life is great, you look great, you feel great, and you are strutting your stuff in your proverbial summer dress, making all the men want you to have their babies. Okay, so we have had our fun for the first half of the month, but of course it can't be this good forever. And so ushers in the beginning of the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is characterized by a surge in progesterone. This key hormone essentially breaks down everything that built up in the first half of the phase, including the endometrium lining. Now, essentially, at this point, ovulation didn't happen, so the egg didn't get fertilized by sperm, and there ain't no babies on the roster this month. So what's the point of having a uterus or a womb that's prepared for a baby? So Progesterone weakens the endometrium lining of the uterus and prepares to shed. And fun fact, if you didn't know this, your period, that blood, is the endometrium lining that is essentially being rejected by the body. Now, if the egg was fertilized by sperm and it got implanted into the uterus to begin growing that fetus, then we would see progesterone continue to build up the endometrium and continue to essentially support the environment that the baby needs to flourish. Common symptoms during this phase: our body temperature and our metabolism increases, okay? And this is also when we tend to see early signs of PMS, which we'll talk about later on. But another fun fact, your luteal phase cannot last any longer than 16 days, okay? And we can tell based on your temperature. If your body temperature hasn't dropped after 16 days, you are pregnant, okay? And that also implies another fun fact, that if you ever get a long or drawn out period or a late period, that doesn't mean that you've had a late luteal phase. It means you're having late ovulation, okay? Because the luteal phase can't last any longer than 16 days, it means that you're having long follicular phases and ovulation isn't happening to then trigger the luteal phase. So if you want to begin working on fixing your long cycles, you have to figure out why you're not ovulating. That's where the secret sauce will be. So again, back to that analogy, we would classify the luteal phase as autumn. It is a time for shedding, just like the leaves shed, our endometrium lining sheds, okay? And I also like to think of this as the time where seasonal depression kicks in, which leads us to the next phase. Last but not least, your period, AKA menstruation. That is phase 4. This is when the woman doesn't fall pregnant, ovulation didn't happen, and as a result, the corpus luteum, that structure that triggered the release of progesterone, it starts to break down. And when it breaks down, progesterone is no longer released. And that essentially signals to the body that it is time to shed the endometrium lining and bleed. And this is what we would call winter, okay? It's a time to hibernate. It's a time for warmth, coziness, eating more. And that is the menstrual cycle in a nutshell. Let's talk about the fertile window, AKA the only time in the month where your man's pull-out game better be of Olympic gold standards. But for real, when can a woman get pregnant? Well, you've got about 5 days leading up to ovulation, plus the day of ovulation, and about 24 hours after, or say 48 to be safe, okay? So that gives us roughly a 6 to 7 day window. Now, after the egg has been released from the ovary and gets reabsorbed into the body, AKA it's no longer in the fallopian tubes, you cannot get pregnant. So your man can afford mistakes then. But here is the catch. If you have had sex in the days leading up to ovulation and sperm has entered the vagina, it can actually wait around for the egg to be released from the ovary, okay? And it does this in a really cool way. So the cervix, which sits directly above the vagina, it contains folds, which we call crypts. And it like catches sperm and like collects it and stores it for later. And then it like gradually releases it over time, okay? So what that means is you basically have more time, AKA more opportunities to fertilize the egg. So tread carefully, my guy. So is this the only natural contraception that you need if you're somebody who is wary of all of the other contraceptive methods out there that have a bevy of drawbacks associated with all of them? Well, not quite, unfortunately. Look, the number of days in a woman's menstrual cycle varies a lot. You know, even if you're a healthy woman, you're not always going to be bang on. And that's why if you're basing your fertile window around the average cycle length, or even looking at the last 3 average cycles, it's pretty risky, okay? Now, in saying so, there are natural contraceptive methods, okay? If you want to be a little bit more accurate, then you can actually work out exactly where you are and when your fertile window opens and closes through 2 main measures. Number 1 is measuring your basal body temperature, and it will have been elevated during your fertile window. And number 2, looking at the changes in your vaginal discharge or your cervical mucus. Now, these methods have been around for a minute, all right? They've been used for generations and they're still used in many cultures today because it gives you some level of control if you are trying to avoid getting pregnant, or it boosts your chances of falling pregnant if you are a trying couple. So here's how you do it. You basically wake up every morning and you take your body temperature. Now, in the 2 to 3 days before your temperature elevates, that is when your fertile window opens, okay? And you can kind of work out when you're going to ovulate based on these numbers. Now look, it's not a huge temperature increase. You're looking at maybe like 0.3 degrees Celsius. So it's not by a lot, but maintaining this higher temperature for roughly about 3 days signals the end of the fertile window, and then your temperature drops after that. Now, there are a few caveats involved in this process that can lead to inaccurate readings. Things like, having a fever or being sick, traveling, not having consistent sleep and wake times, like if you do shift work or if you are underslept or you sleep in on the weekends, if you're stressed, if you consume alcohol, even certain medications can really detract from this process. And that's why it's really beneficial to have another metric to look at, which is your discharge or your cervical mucus. So during the late follicular phase, one of the actions of estrogen is to actually stimulate the crypts in the cervix and make them more watery. And when they become more watery, it obviously changes your discharge and it makes it a little bit more viscous or milky. And it's like slick and slippery. And it's kind of nature's way of telling you that you are fertile. I've even heard that you can purchase ovulation test strips, kind of like a pregnancy test where you pee on it and it tells you based on like the hormone profile, like whether you're ready to make a baby or not. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. So we have covered the menstrual cycle. We've spoken about the fertile window. Now it's time to talk about the 3 main hormones that impact a woman's physiology. Let's talk about estrogen. So we've already spoken about how it thickens the endometrium lining to prepare for a baby, but let's talk about all the other stuff, okay? Stuff that we really care about, okay? How it affects a woman in her life. Well, it increases your strength capacity and your bone density, which is why we can push harder in the gym, specifically around strength training. And this is also why when women hit menopause, their risk of osteoporosis or bone fragility begins to increase, okay? Because estrogen has this protective function. Now it also supports growth hormone production. It increases cortisol and dopamine just to make us feel more alert and prepared to tackle the day. And this is why we feel pumped and we feel good and we recover better as well. Now, interestingly, women can tolerate carbohydrates much better during the follicular phase and ovulation when estrogen is much higher. And that's because estrogen also has some interacting role with insulin to improve the body's insulin sensitivity, and therefore we can handle carbs better. And this has a huge implication to how we essentially handle our nutrition throughout the month, which we'll talk about in the next video. And another interesting fact is that this hormone increases inflammation, which helps to aid the repair process, and histamines are a big part of that process, okay? Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you drink red wine in the first half of your cycle, you may get some headaches because red wine has more histamines than other wines and alcohols, okay? And that's why we tend to be more sensitive to red wine and histamines during this part of the month. Now, estrogen typically tends to pick up at around day 3 of your period, which is why many women tend to report feeling better and can just carry on and move on throughout their day, even when they're still bleeding. While estrogen is great and all, too much is a bad thing. And one thing that we are seeing in the data is that estrogen dominance is really beginning to rise in our society, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about estrogen dominance and how to balance your hormones, because we don't want too little and we don't want too much. So firstly, how does estrogen dominance even happen, okay? It can typically come from 3 main sources, okay? one, the body is making too much, which tends to be the less common of the three factors. Number two, this is the most common. It's coming from another source, okay? It could be coming from our food supply, such as soy being a phytoestrogen. It can come from BPA, which is essentially a compound in plastics. And this has very estrogen-like structure, and it essentially mimics the action of estrogen. Likewise, beauty products contain xenoestrogens, okay? So again, a very similar molecular structure. We also have environmental estrogens, antibiotics. The oral contraceptive pill can elevate your estrogen if your body doesn't stunt its own release of estrogen. And of course, other synthetic hormones, okay? And thirdly, it could be because estrogen is recirculating throughout the body, which essentially means that your body is not detoxifying it the way that it should. And this is more related to health conditions like poor gut health, problems with your circulation and lymphatic drainage, as well as chronic stress and chronic fatigue. So it goes without saying to avoid the things that cause high estrogen in the first place, like soy, tap water, plastics, the pill, and also just lead a better lifestyle. You want to move your body, sleep better, hydrate, support your gut and your adrenal health and your lymphatic system. Essentially optimize the body, and the body will take care of itself. It will heal itself and do what it's meant to do. So how do you know if you have high estrogen? Well, we would look at things like your mood and irritability, especially if it's extremely high at the beginning of the cycle, not pre-period, okay? That's kind of different. Likewise, anxiety and chronic stress, because estrogen increases your cortisol, as we mentioned earlier. Elevated bloating or more water retention than usual, because estrogen acts as a fluid retaining hormone. We also have things like weight gain, changes to your bleeding because there is an overgrowth of the endometrium lining, as well as a thyroid deficiency, okay? So there are comorbidities with having an underactive thyroid because estrogen suppresses thyroid hormone. In terms of supporting a woman with estrogen dominance, like I mentioned, you really do want to limit the amount of external estrogen that is coming from alternative sources, as well as just improving your overall lifestyle and health status so you can help the body establish equilibrium and detoxify estrogen. Now, there are also some supplements that you can take that I would highly recommend. So the first one being DIM, or diindolylmethane. I don't think I pronounced that right, but DIM. It is found in cruciferous vegetables, so things like cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. And basically what it does is it mimics the structure of estrogen. So it isn't a hormone itself, but it binds to excess estrogens and helps the enzyme in our gut to essentially remove them. Now, just a PSA, you would have to eat like 4 kilograms of DIM if you were trying to get it from food sources alone. So I'm gonna just say, do yourself a favor, buy yourself a high quality supplement and call it a day. Next up, we have calcium D-glucarate, which is a calcium salt that promotes healthy excretion of estrogen. Then we have magnesium. Now look, I reckon that everybody should be taking magnesium regardless. It is one of the few minerals that most of the population is deficient in, but specifically for estrogen dominance, it helps support liver enzymes that promote the healthy excretion of estrogen. And alongside that, B6 is another vitamin that I would recommend every single woman take, and I will continually bring this up throughout the next video as well, because it has such a multifaceted impact on improving women's menstrual cycle and symptoms. But specifically for estrogen dominance, what's really great about B6 is that it boosts progesterone, and progesterone has almost like a mitigating effect on estrogen, so it can really counter its effect. So increasing production of progesterone is kind of a good way to go about things. Now, B6 also helps to metabolize and break down the excess estrogens by supporting liver function, similar to the other supplements that I've mentioned already. And I think the most important or profound benefit of B6 is that it really improves your mood and irritability. So if you're somebody who suffers from symptoms of depression or anxiety, having more dopamine through the action of B6 can really help to counter the effects of having too much estrogen in your bloodstream. And finally, I just recommend taking advantage of probiotics and fiber and just cleaning up your diet to favor a healthy gut microbiome, okay? So that way we can restore the balance of good bacteria, which in turn then breaks down the excess estrogens, okay? So it's very holistic in that we want to support all of the different systems that help to recycle and detoxify estrogen. Next up, we have progesterone. So let's go through the functions. If a woman does ovulate and the egg gets fertilized, progesterone is going to thicken the endometrium lining to help the egg implant into the uterus and support the growth of that fetus. And it also inhibits muscular or muscle contractions in the uterus that may potentially cause the body to reject the egg, which is really cool. But in a woman where ovulation doesn't occur, it basically triggers the endometrium lining to shed. Now, progesterone also has some fantastic anti-aging properties. So I know that it gets a bad rap. A lot of people think, oh crap, you know, the second half of the cycle comes with a lot of progesterone and a lot of problems, but it actually reduces blood pressure and inflammation, and it helps a woman stay youthful. And that's why when women hit menopause, they start to see wrinkles, okay? Now, progesterone also has a fantastic fat burning capacity, okay? And I mentioned that estrogen makes a woman's body handle carbohydrates better. Well, on the other hand, progesterone kind of shifts gears and it favors fat oxidation as a primary fuel source instead. So we can essentially use energy via carbs or fat. And when we switch into progesterone mode, our bodies favor fat instead. So it's really, really cool to know that the female body is capable of switching fuel sources like that. And the main reason it does this is because it has a very intimate relationship with metabolism, because it works with the thyroid, okay? And that's why women who have progesterone issues tend to also have over or underactive thyroids as well, so Graves and Hashimoto's, and vice versa. If you have Graves and Hashimoto's, I wouldn't be surprised if you had hormonal imbalances, whether that be higher estrogen or lower estrogen, and same with progesterone as well. Now, progesterone does another really cool thing. It mimics the neurotransmitter GABA in the brain, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It basically promotes the rest and digest mode. It helps you sleep better and just feel calm. It has very inhibitory effects. So allopregnanolone, which is a derivative of progesterone, pretty much mimics those effects, which is really cool. And that's why women tend to have better sleep in the second half of their cycle as progesterone increases. Now, in today's day and age, we're seeing estrogen dominance rise, but we're also seeing that progesterone is beginning to fall. And so balancing the two hormones is crucial as a woman. And I personally struggled with low progesterone, and I really felt it for years. I got my bloods done, but I spent 6 months really focusing on improving my health and taking the right supplements. And I can happily say that my progesterone is really well balanced now. So let's talk about what causes low progesterone. For me, chronic stress. So I know it's easier said than done, but y'all need to stress less because it really does mess up your hormones, okay? Taking the oral contraceptive pill, a poor diet, environmental toxins, having too much estrogen comparative to the amount of progesterone you have, as well as PCOS, okay? Polycystic ovarian syndrome. This is a very key or core trait of this disease. So again, this implies that there needs to be a lot of lifestyle management and just improving your health in general to help balance these hormones, okay? But there are more specific ways that we can manage low progesterone. Now, while it isn't that hard to fix and lifestyle changes should be enough, I would say you need to dedicate a good 3 months at least to this process. Now, the thing is, when you have an issue with progesterone, it implies that there's a problem earlier in the cycle, okay? It implies that there's an issue with ovulation, because after ovulation or during, that's when progesterone increases. So if ovulation is is faulty, I wouldn't be surprised if progesterone is faulty. In terms of supplements that you can take to support progesterone, the first one I'd recommend, which I personally took, was chasteberry. Very, very easy to find, and it's pretty damn cool. What it does is it travels to the pituitary gland, the one that controls FSH and LH, and basically tells it to produce more luteinizing hormone, or LH, okay? And that's the hormone that essentially triggers ovulation. After ovulation occurs, the corpus luteum can form as it should, and then it can trigger the surge of progesterone. So that's kind of how it works. Again, B6. Every woman needs to take B6, okay? So like I said earlier, it actually does increase progesterone. Even taking less than a gram a day, I would say around 800 grams a day, is really good to balance your estrogen relative to your progesterone and find equilibrium. Magnesium, again, is an MVP. It really helps to boost the effects of progesterone on the body. So it helps progesterone work better on your thyroid and your central nervous system, so you can feel better and actually reap the rewards of this hormone, okay? So B6 and magnesium should be a staple in your supplements cupboard. Now, the biggest thing is stress management. You really can't take a pill to fix that, okay? Elevated cortisol levels are associated with low progesterone and high estrogen. So you really want to do the inner work and the external work to ensure you have a lifestyle that supports a relatively low stress environment, not forever, but at least to find that balance again, okay? Don't bite off more than you can chew, even if it means saying no at work a little bit more, just for the short term. Sleep earlier, stop drinking alcohol and partying as much, pick up the pen and journal and meditate and fix your unresolved trauma and shit. Like, it's so imperative, because even if your diet and your supplement stack and your nutrition is on point, if your internal stress status is not improving, you're basically making it harder to heal. And just to really drive this point home, progesterone is the precursor to cortisol. When your cortisol levels get really high, we end up seeing progesterone levels decrease, okay? So the balance between these two hormones is essential. And lastly, we have testosterone. Now, this is known as a male hormone, but it is also found in women. We need testosterone as well. It's produced in the adrenal glands as well as the ovaries, and it is the most consistent release out of all of the hormones throughout the cycle. So it doesn't really change much except during ovulation. That's when we get that peak, and we get all of the great benefits of testosterone, including protein synthesis. That's where we make gains, okay? So testosterone is great for muscular development, and it also strengthens your ligaments and builds muscle and bone. So it's really protective in that sense. It also assists your brain function and immunity, okay? So do not underestimate the role of testosterone in a woman. It increases our dopamine, so we can get more pleasure, we get more energy and motivation, and people, or women specifically, with less testosterone than what we consider normal, the clitoris of a woman tends to be smaller when she has less testosterone. It's linked to other problems, most specifically PCOS, which I mentioned earlier. And I can make another video about that another day. I actually have a podcast on it if you want to listen. I'll drop it in the description box below. But there is a relationship between low progesterone and high testosterone, and balancing all of that in the case of PCOS. Aside from that, adrenal problems or thyroid disorders, as well as diabetes especially, all tend to be implicated with high testosterone, because it has a role to play in metabolism, specifically insulin as well. Now, environmental pollutants such as heavy metals can lead to high testosterone, and that's why I would suggest increasing antioxidant rich foods, okay? So that will help to naturally reduce testosterone levels. Things like berries, cruciferous vegetables again, capsicum, garlic, onion, all of those are really good to incorporate. Now, in terms of managing testosterone, if it is too high, again, looking at progesterone is going to be the answer, because it is a precursor to testosterone. So yeah, progesterone has a lot to do with a lot. And then also addressing insulin sensitivity and any metabolic syndromes. If you have fatty liver problems, if you have insulin resistance, we really want to, again, fix up the diet, fix up the lifestyle, sleep better, move more, and let the body heal itself. But if there was one supplement that I would recommend that you take, it would be inositol. Inositol is something that all my girls with PCOS who have high testosterone take. And it's really, really good to help resensitize your body's cells to insulin, which will therefore improve your testosterone markers. There's also things like berberine as well, which can really help in the context of PCOS, but I wouldn't be surprised if it helps those with high testosterone who don't have PCOS either. And that is it for part 1 of this ultimate period handbook. So now you know all things about how the month plays out for a woman, how the hormones influence the cycle, and how to balance your hormones if you do have an imbalance. In the next video, we're going to talk about how we can practically apply this information in day-to-day life. So how should a woman train? How should she eat? Should her work change throughout the cycle? So stay tuned for next week's video. It will be dropping Monday evenings, Australian Eastern Standard Time. Look forward to seeing you there. Ciao.